I was already in the rice field and ready to work on tending the rice plants. I saw a beautiful view surrounding my rice field. This morning the air was still cool. Dew stuck to the tips of the fresh green rice leaves. I was already in the rice field, ready to pull out the weeds growing among the rice plants. But before that, I decided to hunt for snails first. Carrying a small bucket tied to my waist, I walked along the rice field embankments, looking for snails that usually hide among the mud and grass. Every step I took left a footprint on the still wet ground, and the sound of trickling water accompanied my journey. Every now and then I bent down, picking up snails that seemed to be stuck to the rice stalks or settling at the bottom of the rice field. One by one I picked up the snails from between the mud of the rice fields. Some were still small, their shells smooth and thin, as if they had just hatched. There were also some that were already big, with thick and slippery shells, indicating their older age. I observed the snails for a moment before putting them in the small bucket I brought. Some tried to hide in their shells, perhaps feeling disturbed because they were suddenly lifted from their place. The rice fields were still full of clear water from the irrigation channels, making my search easier. I walked slowly, my feet feeling like they were sinking a little in the soft mud. Every time I bent down, muddy water flowed slowly from between the green rice stalks. In some places, the snails gathered in large numbers, hiding behind the wild grass growing on the edge of the rice fields. I pushed aside the grass and found more, some already stuck firmly to the rice stalks, perhaps looking for food. The sunlight began to rise, warming my body. The sound of rice field birds answered each other, accompanying my work this morning. I kept picking up snails, not wanting to miss any. These snails could be used later, either for duck feed or processed into food. After my bucket was almost full, I stopped for a moment. I looked at the contents of the bucket. The snails were moving slowly, trying to adjust to their new place. I smiled with satisfaction. Today I had quite a lot of catch. Now, it was time to get back to work, pulling out weeds so that the rice plants could grow well without disturbance. I stepped into the middle of the rice field, ready to continue my task with a burning spirit. My hands continued to work, picking up snails and pulling out grass that could hinder the growth of the rice. Sometimes, I found larger snails, with sturdy shells and darker colors. I smiled to myself, feeling like I was looking for a small treasure in the middle of the rice fields. From a distance, I could hear the voices of mothers talking, perhaps discussing the price of rice or plans for the upcoming harvest. Sparrows flew in the sky, occasionally coming down to steal young rice grains. I kept working, enjoying the peace amidst the green rice and the fresh morning air, while my container was increasingly full of small snails mixed with large snails. The sun was getting hotter, shining on the expanse of green rice fields. A gentle breeze blew, bringing the scent of moist and fresh soil. I stood in the middle of the embankment, my feet slightly submerged in the mud, while I remained engrossed in my work, even though sweat had soaked my entire body. However, in the midst of all that busyness, my eyes often caught something else: small snails scattered among the rice stalks. Without thinking, I bent down and picked them up one by one. Their shells were slippery with mud, and some of them still had air bubbles when lifted from the water, and I washed them with water until they made a water sound. The sun was getting higher in the sky, its rays felt stinging on my skin. Sweat was pouring down my forehead, soaking into my clothes that had been wet since earlier. Even so, I didn't stop my hands from moving, getting more and more excited to pick up the snails scattered among the mud in the rice fields. Every time I found one, there was a sense of satisfaction that made me even more excited to look for more. The warm rice field water inundated my feet, giving a refreshing sensation in the midst of the hot weather. I no longer cared about the mud that stuck to my hands and feet. My hands continued to dig into the surface of the water, looking for snails that often hid behind wild grass or rice stalks that were starting to grow taller. Every now and then, I lifted a snail that was still attached to a leaf, staring at it for a moment before putting it in a container that was starting to fill up. In the distance, the sound of people working in the rice fields could still be heard faintly. Several farmers seemed busy with their hoes and sickles, preparing the soil or clearing weeds that interfered with the growth of the rice. But I remained immersed in my own world, enjoying this simple pleasure. Every snail I found seemed like a small achievement. The more I collected, the more satisfied I felt because the rice plants would be safer from snail attacks.
The wind that blew occasionally brought a little coolness, although it was not enough to dispel the heat that enveloped my body. I wiped the sweat on my forehead with my sleeve that was already dirty with mud, then bent down again, reaching for another snail that looked shiny underwater. Time seemed to pass so quickly. I don't know how long I've been here, but looking at the results I've collected, it feels like I've spent quite a lot of time. With a slightly gasping breath, I stood up straight, stretching my body that was starting to ache. The vast rice fields still stretched out before me, filled with the soothing sounds of nature. I smiled in satisfaction, looking at the container filled with the snails I had caught. Today, even though the heat was scorching and sweat was pouring down my face, I felt happy. There was a simple happiness in picking up snails in the rice fields, in enjoying every moment that passed without rushing. As my hand reached for the snail from the calm water, my mind wandered far away, imagining the days to come. I imagined the harvest time, when this expanse of rice fields would turn into a sea of gold, the rice grains turning perfectly yellow, ready to be picked. My heart felt warm at the thought. I knew how happy I would be when I saw the results of my hard work pay off, when the grains of rice that had been so painstakingly cared for could finally be harvested and taken home. However, my daydreaming stopped for a moment when I realized the reality. The rice growing in front of me was still fresh green, only 1 month old. The journey was still long, there was still much to be done so that these plants would grow well. I had to make sure this rice field remained free from annoying weeds, ensure that the stagnant water was enough to give life to these young rice plants. Pests also had to be watched out for. The snails I was now picking up were actually one of the threats to the rice. They could devour these young stalks if left too numerous. I took a deep breath, looking around the rice fields. The afternoon air was getting hotter, the sun was getting higher, and the sweat on my body was getting heavier. But I didn't mind. All this hard work was part of the long journey towards the harvest I dreamed of. I know, planting rice is not an easy job. From sowing seeds, caring for seedlings, irrigating the rice fields, to facing various challenges of nature, everything requires diligence and patience. I bent down again, picking up a few more snails. The container I was carrying was getting fuller, and I smiled a little. At least, there was one small task that I could complete today. Although the harvest was still far away, every small effort was part of the process. I imagined later, when the harvest season arrived, people would be busy in the rice fields, helping each other cut and tie the rice. The sound of laughter would echo, creating an atmosphere full of warmth. And when that time came, I knew, all this hard work would be paid off with priceless happiness. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, then went back to my work. This rice field still needs maintenance, and I will make sure that every drop of sweat that falls today will be part of a proud harvest in the future. I kept walking, counting in my heart, how many more steps until I could stop for a moment, enjoying a cup of cold coffee that I brought from home. I had imagined the sensation of sipping cold coffee, the bitter taste combined with a little sweetness would refresh my dry throat. I had also prepared a cigarette, which I would light while sitting on the embankment, enjoying the gentle breeze blowing from the hill. When I finally reached a fairly shady place on the edge of the rice field, the freshness immediately seeped into my body, banishing the fatigue that had accumulated since this morning. I lit a cigarette, then lit it with a small match. Thin smoke rose slowly into the air, blending with the gentle wind. I stared at the vast expanse of rice fields, watching the fresh green rice sway in the wind. Small birds flew around, occasionally coming down to look for food among the rice stalks. This is a little bit of my work in the rice field today. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for watching. See you in another video.